Welcome to today's event, The Ministry for the Future, Climate Change and Speculative Fiction with Kim Stanley Robinson, which is part of Perry World House's global programming on global art, film, music, and writing. We're delighted to welcome Kim Stanley Robinson, renowned science fiction author and author of this recent book, The Ministry of the Future, to the virtual stage today. Kim Stanley Robinson is a New York Times bestselling author and winner of the Hugo, Nebula, and Locus Awards. He's the author of more than 20 books, including the best-selling Mars trilogy and the critically acclaimed New York 2140, The Years of Rice and Salt, and 2312. In 2008, he was named a Hero of the Environment by Time magazine, and he works with the Sierra Nevada Research Institute. He lives in Davis, California, and I'd be remiss if I didn't say he also shares with me UC San Diego in his background. His latest novel is Ministry of the Future, one of Barack Obama's favorite books of 2020, and you'll find a link to the book in the Zoom chat. So thank you so much for joining us today, Stan. Thanks for making the time to be here with us today. I'm going to turn it over to you for a couple of minutes of brief opening remarks, and then we'll begin our discussion. So Stan, welcome.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for having me. Thank you to the Perry World House. It's really a pleasure to be with you. I will just briefly make some remarks that situating my novel Ministry for the Future, and then hand it back to you so that we can you can guide our discussion. And I really appreciate it. I wrote the Ministry for the Future in 2019, and I actually finished it in February of 2020, about a week before the pandemic closed down United States society and most of the rest of the world. So that was an odd sequence of events, and it's changed the response to the book and also changed my own mental relationship to the book. I wrote it in an attempt to sketch out a scenario of what I would consider to be a kind of a best case scenario for world history over the next 3 decades, focusing in on dodging the mass extinction event, which is kind of a low bar for utopian fiction, but I felt like that's where we are. And if we could do that, if we do dodge a mass extinction event by the year 2050, these next 3 decades are crucial for that. That would be a big victory. And although it's been said, I think very correctly, that this novel is not so much utopian as it is anti-dystopian, which is not quite the same thing. That was my hope. When the pandemic struck, I thought, well, once again, science fiction obsolescent the very moment of publication, or even before, because my book didn't come out till October of 2020. I wondered how people would read it in a world that had been utterly changed by the pandemic, whether it would look as out of date as it felt to me. And what I think happened was that the pandemic made everybody realize viscerally, like in your lived daily experience, that we're in a global civilization and that we depend on our biosphere for our own health. These two undeniable facts slapping us in the face have changed our sense of time, history, and the world that we're in. So you have to think about me writing this book in the Trump era and before the pandemic. So things that I portrayed in the novel as happening as the result of gigantic upheavals, of chaos and disorder and tragedy, forcing us into a better response to our social relation to the biosphere and to each other. A lot of the things that I put into the 2030s are already happening now. So the book is wrong. That's fine. It's better that way. And no science fiction novel predicts the actual future. It's always a scenario based out of its own time's experience, an attempt to, it's like a time capsule. It's one of the greatest ways of understanding the past is to look to the past science fiction and what they thought their futurity might feel like. So, and it's always wrong about the future. It's always right about the present, and can be used as a diagnostic for historians in a remarkable way. And hopefully it can stay, it holds its own aesthetic base as a work of art that includes but is separate from all those other considerations. So when I say that things I portrayed as happening in the 2030s under great duress, now I see happening, and maybe it means we are under the great duress now. The carbon coin in my novel, the notion that the central banks of the world would band together to pay people for decarbonization in many forms, what has been called carbon quantitative easing, so that new money be made from scratch, the way central banks can do, and the way quantitative easing works already, devoted in its initial creation of money precisely to the decarbonization effort. There is now a network for greening the financial system, which I did not know about in 2019, although it already existed then. 89 of the central banks, including the EU, our Fed, the Bank of China, the Bank of Russia, and 80 more prominent central banks of the world are now a network to try to green the financial system, as their title says. And they have recently put out a paper with 9 suggestions of how to do that. Very monetary versus fiscal, very central bank conservative. Possibly those 9 things that they are proposing that they could do are the carbon coin in its real manifestation. Maybe it's just a step towards the carbon coin. I can't tell, but it's happening now. And carbon quantitative easing is part of the EU's plan for their green recovery. It's part of the Biden stimulus bills. And in a sense, we see that already happening. The other thing that I thought was highly science fictional and aspirational comes out of E.O. Wilson's half-Earth proposal, that we leave half of the surface of the Earth and half of the oceans to the wild animals so that they can prosper on their own and not be as screwed up by us as they are now being screwed up. And given that 97% of the biomass on our planet is human beings and their food animals, this is a terrifying fact that means that habitat creation and taking care of our fellow species on the planet is a priority now for avoiding the mass extinction event. And so I wrote it into Ministry for the Future as happening with a great conflict. Now, California, many countries around the world are talking about 30 by 30, that by the year 2030, 30% of the land mass will be protected in one status or another of protected status so that the wild creatures can do better. Well, this is, I find, rather astonishing. When E.O. Wilson published his book, which perhaps 10 years ago, it was widely regarded as an old man's utopian vision. And yet now something very like it is in the policy stream for the biggest nation states and for the global community. Does this represent improvement? Should we therefore have hope? I think so. And so with that, I will turn it back over to Michael with thanks, and let's see where you take us.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And, there's so much, this book is so rich for any audience, but I think especially for ours, because you deal with, so many policy issues and I just want to, but I want to actually ask you about an opening scene of the book. So, I've worked for many years on impacts, adaptation, vulnerability. And of course, one of the big concerns in that area is extreme heat. And your book, I think better than any IPCC document, portrays what that, what does that really mean? Extreme heat event. The book opens with a shocking scene of many millions of people dying over the course of a couple of days in India because of wet bulb temperatures of 35 degrees, I think it was, which is incompatible with human life. And I guess I wonder, you propel us into your story with this shocking event, and can you talk about that and what you hope that does for the audience and what it does for the story?
Yeah. Well, it began from a moment of fear, or an ongoing feeling of fear that this could really happen. And I also wanted, in this slap in the face way, to remind people who were talking about adaptation. There was a a line of thought going around in the last decade that we're not going to manage to hold to the 1.5 degrees temperature rise, or even the 2 degree. Might go to 3, might go to 4. Humans are adaptable. We would just adapt. This was a line of thought that was being promulgated. Adaptationists, eco-modernists, humanities departments, philosophy departments. They weren't usually ecologists saying this, but it was being said and put about, and economists. And there was a feeling that, this 1.5 degree was somewhat arbitrary, it was made up. Well, then the data began to come in that actually human beings do very poorly at a wet bulb 35 or above. You're simply poached and die. Our methods for discharging heats from our body are not made to deal with that combination of heat and humidity, which is coming down on us. It's already been registered in thermometers and weather stations around the earth for brief moments of time. One of the hottest wet bulb temperatures ever recorded was outside of Chicago in 1994 or 5. So it can happen anywhere in the tropics for sure, in the semi-tropics and all the way up to, we don't know yet what latitude, because strange things happen with weather with this much extra energy in the system. I wanted to write that. I wanted to kill the idea that we have some leeway on the margin at the top end of the temperature rise, that it was simply not true. And these people, the adaptationists advocating that we'll just adapt, were not reacting to the newest data on the that was in the scientific literature on this issue. So, well, this is what then fiction. I mean, to write it down as a scene, a rather horrid, week or month of my life. But this is what fiction can do. It can put you there. In your mind, you are time traveling. In your mind, you are telepathic. These are fictional experiences, but fiction is real. So then when you live it as a thick texture, as an experience, as a reader, because the readers are so generous in their mental effort, they imagine it from these marks on the page, and it's as if it's happened to them, like a hallucination or a waking dream. A very powerful experience it can be. So I wanted to put us all through that, and it was not a happy writing week, but I felt like it needed to be done. And then also, since we are getting very close to that happening in the real world, it could happen this year, but it certainly could happen more and more as we go forward. What then would we do about it? Would it be like mass shootings in the United States, where we moan and groan and then go on as we were before and ignore that lesson? Or would we learn a lesson from it? And that was part of the exploration of my novel, because in fact, both would happen.
Right.
People would say, well, that happens in the tropics. That happens to other people. That happens to poor people who don't have a good electrical grid. That happens to someone else. This is the standard human response. And to a certain extent, it's true. Until it happens to you, you don't believe it. But then it does happen to you. And that fictional experience might prompt an action before it actually happens to you.
I mean, your comparison to mass shootings is terrifying, of course. But in the novel, many things kind of flow from this. But at least 4 things are that the UNFCCC becomes what the UN would call an operating agency, and actually begins to do more. The world order fractures, and India takes matters into their own hands. Climate vigilantism begins, and then the central banks get involved. And I'd love to just kind of, these are really, as I was reading the book, I was thinking a lot about the role that fiction has for the kind of policy imagination. Like it really, it's very difficult to actually, we're coming up to the global stocktake that you write about in the book. And, I am, the UN will not say that the global stocktake will fail, but chances are we're going to go to the global stocktake and say, we're not doing enough. And so, we need to propel ourselves into action. So I wanted to explore some of these bits, starting with kind of the breakdown of the kind of, multilateralism. So in the book, India goes it alone. And just, you almost say it in passing, they just tried geoengineering on their own. Love to know, your thoughts on that. As I've heard you talk about this is something the left is generally very uncomfortable with, the idea of geoengineering. But in your book, India just does it and says, we've lived through hell, you have not, we have to try this. Maybe you could talk a bit about that part of the book.
Sure. We have no international protocol now. If India or anyone else, an individual billionaire or any nation state on earth were to do it now, they would not be contravening any treaty or laws. There's no such thing. We
Exactly.
have no protocol. It's an idea only, and it's a controversial idea, and it's an idea that has been reified. It's been turned into a thing, and what it is as a thing, here's what it is. Geoengineering, bad. Silver bullet coming out of Silicon Valley and a poor understanding of the world, capitalists who want to keep on doing capital, fossil fuel extractors who want to keep on burning fossil fuels and get away with it. Therefore, it's obviously bad because we need social progress. We need a change of the system entire, not just a patch that doesn't fix things but masks the problem. Well, all that's true and also irrelevant and also not true. And this is the world that we're in. If we don't decarbonize as fast as we can, we are likely to get into situations where nations that burned very little carbon are taking the first hit from heat extremity incidences. Some of them, like India, Indonesia, others, they have the technological capacity to throw some dust into the air and deflect some sunlight for 5 years or so. I talk about a Pinatubo because the scientists talk about Pinatubo, volcano that went off in 91 or 95 in the Philippines. And for the next 3 or 4 years, temperatures worldwide were about 1 degree depressed. After that, the dust fell to the ground and we went on as before. So there were several kinds of reification going on. This notion that we would, oh my God, we'd create a snowpiercer the very first time we tried something is not right. It would be an experiment. It would be a global experiment. It has potential bad effects on the monsoon. There's no doubt about it. That it's not as if this is a great solution. But what I'm saying in my book and in my talks is that in an emergency, if we could lower the temperature on Earth by a degree or so for 5 years, and then the experiment was over, we might do that, and it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. It would not be eco-fascism. It would not be crazed silicon techno villains as out of a superhero movie, destroying life on Earth for their own private gain. It would be an emergency measure that we tried out to see what happened. Probably it won't be sulfur dioxide, which is what comes out of volcanoes and which damages the ozone layer. And possibly it would be limestone dust, which is already in the atmosphere and is inert and would be easier on the ozone layer and yet still deflect sunlight. Maybe we'll never do it because we'll never have to, but the discussion of it should not be taboo. And to have a judgment against it ahead of time is ridiculous because we are in an all hands on deck situation. Everything needs to be considered, including very strange things. And some of them are demonstrably good no matter what else happens. We can talk about those later, so I don't go on too long. But I guess what I would end up saying about geoengineering is everything that humanity does at scale now, and that includes things at the legal level, as well as the machinery level, is geoengineering. Is it targeted towards decarbonization, or does it worsen the carbon burn? These are questions that need to be answered, but you cannot just table the idea of geoengineering because we're doing it already. We've been doing it since the agricultural revolution. We've been crap at it since the industrial revolution. And now if we do it to try to mitigate the damage, then there is no reason to have a philosophical objection to the idea. This kind of response, oh, well, there are some things man was not yet meant to know, a kind of an early romantic, and I mean the romantic era, response to the increase of technological power, this kind of Prometheus, Frankenstein myth. Well, it's interesting stuff and basic to our thinking, but it's not relevant to the geoengineering question.
I quite agree. I mean, it often feels like people are comparing, we achieve 1.5 versus geoengineering as opposed to we're dealing with 35-degree wet bulb days and, we need to try something. So no, I really appreciated that. It's actually a topic that we're working on at Prairie World House. So maybe sometime we'll have you back to talk just about that. I would love to do that. I wanted to move on though to one of the things that happens in the book is the informal name for one of the subsidiary bodies of the UNFCCC becomes the Ministry for the Future. And so one of the things, another place that you part company from some of your fellow environmental lefties is you obviously have a lot of sincere admiration and enthusiasm for the Paris Agreement, for the Framework Convention, for this multilateral process. So, but you also imagine that it needs to change. And I wonder, how is working in the fictional realm informed your actual views about how should we have people on the call from the UN? How should they be thinking about changing?
Well, I myself consider the Paris Agreement to be almost a miracle and a major event in world history. And anybody critiquing it, I want to say to them immediately is, what are you talking about? What's better? What have you got to suggest to replace the Paris Agreement for dealing with this problem? And the answer is nothing.
Mm-hmm.
The Paris Agreement is the UN's platform for trying to deal with global climate change. It's a global biosphere problem and in a nation state system. The governance in this world is not well equipped for dealing with global problems. There are approximately 200 nations. They all have different priorities. They're all trying to protect their own interests, and yet they're all on one planet with one problem together. They have to discuss it. The Paris Agreement is the platform for discussing it. And if you would read the agreement, which many people don't, it has indeed, Article 3 is, we have to keep making this agreement better as we go forward. We commit to ambitious improvements in the agreement and its goals. Mm-hmm. Now, I have to, you have to qualify this. The original Paris Agreement emissions promises by the various nation states were generally very soft targets. And it's entirely voluntary. Mm-hmm. But where's the sheriff? I mean, it isn't as if you can call up a sheriff and say, we need somebody that will enforce this agreement. Most international treaties are voluntary in the end, in that you can be sanctioned, but you can ignore those sanctions. So because it's improvable, because it's voluntary, everybody signed it. The global stock take, everybody will get together and go, wow, we didn't meet our agreements. And at the same time, we actually have to increase our agreements. Mm-hmm. The sense of urgency of the screws being applied, of knowing that we are not coping with a global biosphere crisis will be accentuated as if under a lens, like a microscope, by the Paris Agreement discussions. At that point, people are going to be coming in, they're going to be dealing on the side. The big emissions burners, really China, the United States, the European Union, a few other countries, they account for about 90% of the carbon burn. And so on the side, they have to agree with each other not to blow up the world, not to treat it as a zero-sum game. Mm-hmm. And also, they have to pay the big petro states, which are exactly these same players, for the fossil fuels that they're going to leave in the ground, that they have to leave in the ground, or else they blow up the world. So that becomes a process of international negotiation that needs a space in which to do the negotiating, and that's the Paris Agreement. Mm-hmm. So they have a little clause there, though there's two more things to say about it. It insists on climate equity, that mm-hmm. there shall be shared but differentiated responsibilities between developed nations that are rich and burned a lot of the carbon and were the colonial powers, mm-hmm. and the developing world that are poor, that are in the tropics, that didn't burn much carbon, and were still coming out of post-colonial and neo-post-colonial type economic colonialism, and are just poorly positioned in the world of capital to cope the way the developed nations are. So that the Paris Agreement, by a phenomenal effort by the diplomats arranging it, to write in these clauses that insist on climate equity. And so they'll get together, they'll talk about these issues. And if we fail, then the Paris Agreement becomes the League of Nations, and we enter into something worse than World War II. That could happen. If we succeed, that will be the place in which we negotiated the success. Mm-hmm. So I urge people to read the damn thing and then make their opinions, and not get into knee-jerk I'm part of a community, environmentalist leftist community, an eco-socialist. I mean, these are my own personal values. And so I'm particularly offended if people claiming those same values will go for knee-jerk reactions that were appropriate in the year 1985, because
Yep.
we're not in the year 1985.
Yep. No, I mean, I, quite agree. So, I mean, well, just before we leave the Paris Agreement, as I would love to talk about Article 6 and Article 8 and all, but I wonder, as a writer, like, what do you think of it as a piece of writing? I mean, you encouraging everybody to read it.
Yeah, well, I tell you what, I'm glad you asked that, because what it is it's a science fiction story. It's a
Mhm.
utopian science fiction story in the form, very hilariously, like Borges or J.G. Ballard or Italo Calvino. It's in the form of a dry UN document with, I think, 16 articles, and it takes about 19 pages. So it's a short story, and its language is compactified. And what you have to understand is, as a work of art, it's quite hilarious, quite beautiful. Sometimes there is a phrase that implies all kinds of counterfactual things coming true. Sometimes there's a clause that implies that people are at basis good. There's a theory of human nature, in other words. There's a plot, there's a setting, there's characters, which are the nation states, different kinds of nation states. Philip K. Dick used to write novels in which there was the big protagonist and the little protagonist, a common person that was in the face of the disaster, and a big capitalist who was trying to pull the puppet strings. Well, the Paris Agreement has its big protagonists and its little protagonists, with the developed nations and the developing nations. So read it as a fiction, and you may be laughing, and also inspired, because it is a working policy document that sets frameworks for all kinds of things, including, like, where do we get the money and how do we indemnify? Will we still have insurance? These are all tucked into phrases here or there. And lastly, I'm going to say this, that it's way more, that diplomatic language is way more transparent than either legal language or financial language. So that if you go to the Network for Greening the Financial System, the what would that be? GFS. It's a real thing. You read their 9-point document about how they can save the world from a climate disaster by way of monetary policy. That tried to write a translation of that into English to see if I understood it, and some of those 9 points defeated me, because the jargon of monetization is a little bit denser and more resistant to ordinary human understanding than diplomatic language. The Paris Agreement is remarkably articulate and clear. So, as I say, 19 pages, quite funny as a short story.
I will resist the urge to ask you many more questions about the Paris Agreement. Before we, audience, please start putting your questions in the Q&A. But I did the other piece, the other kind of main response that happens in the book is, real violence. So there's the kind of the violence of what happens to the victims of the heat wave, but also vigilante violence. And so while you have characters trying to do things by multilateral processes or by national processes, there's also eco-terrorism in the book. And I'd love to hear your reflections on that, and especially because you said your thinking has evolved a bit since the pandemic. Like, is this coming? Is this necessary? Is this a way of turning the slow violence of climate change to something that's more present for people?
Well, I have to remind myself and everyone, I am a middle-class suburban American, and I believe in nonviolence, and I wouldn't commit violent acts against people myself, so I don't want to be seen to be urging it on anyone else. That would be morally incoherent and wrong. That what I was thinking about in the novel was that if we don't deal with climate change, the amount of human misery and suffering that is going to occur is going to create huge wells of anger, chaos, and resistance. So the system as such, neoliberal capitalism, is violent against a billion or two people on Earth. Slow violence, it's called. Then that will erupt into fast violence and into spasms of revenge. In my novel, it's a little bit um, idealized as being effective, as being well thought out. Usually it's ineffective and spasmodic and yet still destructive as hell. And I also, in my novel, I don't think made a proper distinction that ought to be made between violence against property, destruction of property, and violence against people, against human beings and bodies. That
Hmm.
distinction is a valid one. Between sabotage and terrorism is a real distinction. And the Swedish philosopher Andreas Malm has written a book called How to Blow Up a Pipeline. This is not a technical guide to blowing up a pipeline. It's not like Dave Foreman's book Ecotage, which is a kind of a how-to guide. It's a philosophical treatise on what are we justified in doing in resistance to the destruction of the biosphere that future generations are not going to be able to recover from. What's justified for us to do? And that's an interesting question that I think that what I can say about my novel is that my novel reflects the chaotic um, way that we approach these issues. We don't destrand them. We don't make good distinctions between one kind of violence and another. And it all seems to be confusion, a kaleidoscopic chaos of daily incidents that seem to make no sense and have no plan. You know, history as chaos. And so the novel, I think, in reflecting that, it might not be as clear as it could be on these individual moral and tactical decisions. You know, if there are several things that if I were to write it again, I would change, but I don't have that opportunity.
Um, well, there's always the next one. But so I'm going to start taking audience questions. So one of our students actually, you know, you spoke about climate doomism, and you know, thinking that that's not helpful. But he says, but maybe if we hyper focus on ideal goals such as the Paris targets, that actually prevents, you know, this planning for, you know, serious planning for what could happen if there's really substantial climate disruption. So he wonders, how do you think about the right, you know, I guess as a policy issue, how do you think about a good balance between realism about the long odds, but also kind of you know, keeping ourselves motivated?
It's a tough balance to keep because we are in such a bad situation right now that realistic assessment, if you can believe that any such thing is possible, um, it puts us in a very bad situation. And indeed, the National Academy of Sciences puts our odds of keeping the temperature below 2 degrees at something like 5%. They've written a paper about it. Now,
Mm-hmm.
that too is a science fiction story. This is the thing. Anything that talks about the future, even demographers' graphics, everything that isn't astronomical tables, like you can predict an eclipse, you can't predict a human population in the year 2100. Human history doesn't have that kind of inexorable trajectory. So we're in it. That's it. Trying to think about the future without going into doomism, which is that point of view that says we're already doomed to a biosphere crash. We are simply zombies now. We're in a zombie culture that is already dead and doesn't know it, or like Wile E. Coyote, you're off the cliff, you're spinning in air, you look around, you suddenly see there's no ground under you, and we're beginning the fall. It's one way to see it, but it's not right. In fact, on the level of physics, on the level of ecology, if we were to start doing everything right now, and given the powers that we have to create clean energy and to pull carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere, the one thing we can't come back from is extinctions.
Mm-hmm.
So saving endangered species and creating habitat for them, the whole Leopoldian land ethic, what's good is what's good for the land, by which he means the biosphere, I take it. What's good is what's good for the biosphere. Dodge the extinction event. Don't worry too much about anything but that. Therefore, mitigation, this whole notion of mitigation versus adaptation. Should we try to stop burning carbon, or should we just adjust to the world that's coming? Well, mitigation. Mitigation is the best adaptation, and
Sure.
adaptation is often a lie. What Zizek calls cruel optimism. Well, cruel optimism is saying everything's going to be all right. We'll just adapt. And then there's also stupid pessimism, like we're doomed already. So between cruel optimism and stupid pessimism, you have to actually give up on that binary. Optimism and pessimism is irrelevant now. There's simply work to be done. And you can talk about hope. Maybe this is a kind of, I think of hope as a biological function. In other words, hunger is a hope that you'll get the energy to live on. So hope is very biologically based, and it's good to hold on to it, because if you don't have hope, you are depressed, you are dying, etc. So hope is a term that I think is like a permanent, basic biological term. Optimism, pessimism, maybe this is just kind of middle-class American bourgeois. Oh, I feel good, I feel bad. Who cares how you feel? What needs to be done is the work that is necessary to dodge the mass extinction event. And whatever that is, no matter how you judge our future options going forward, like, well, this isn't going to work, but I need to try it anyway. Okay, you try it. Oh, this is going to work if we do it right. Okay, you do it. So our judgment of future being a science fiction story, you can run dystopian futures, utopian futures. They are ways to orient yourself to what you do today. And what we do today is the crucial thing.
I can't help myself as a philosopher of science and a since boyhood science fiction fan. Though, ask you. So you say we can't predict the future. All we have is science fiction. I mean, so no psychohistory for us. Is that
right? Right. No psychohistory.
I mean, and Marx is trying to predict the future too. I mean,
yeah. Well, Marx was the greatest historian one can imagine, and a great political economist doing political economy. As a science fiction writer, he's like all the rest of us. Notice that his predictions came wrong. Nobody can predict the future, and science fiction is not in that game. Asimov is very good on this. When he was asked to predict 50 years into the future in 1964, we all pulled that out in 2014 and looked at what he said. It was a huge lesson on what can be predicted and what can't.
A lot of nuclear gadgets for Asimov.
I mean, well, yes.
That really strikes you.
Yeah, and he was agoraphobic, and so everybody was indoors or at the bottom of the ocean. That was cool. No windows needed anymore. That was comforting to him. It's a hilarious document, but he was great on the overdetermining thing that couldn't be dodged, which was the population was going to grow. We had conquered public health issues and disease issues such that we were going to have population growth, and that was going to impact everything else. He was absolutely right on that, because that was an overdetermining factor. What we can say now is climate change is going to be an overdetermining factor. 50 years from now, they're still going to be dealing with climate change because the momentum is there and because it's global. So, but what I say about science fiction now is that it's halfway between, you try to be a prophet. This is going to happen. I'm either going to scare you or inspire you by telling you what's going to happen. An ancient thing, prophecy. Do you want to be Jeremiah? Do you want to be Ezekiel? You choose your modality and prophesy. Very powerful. But also, it's a metaphor for what's going on right now. So it's like 3D glasses. Back when there were 3D movies, one lens is showing you an image of the future as scenarioized. One image is like, this is what today feels like. A good science fiction reader correlates the two and gets a false 3D, which is temporal. You get a false sense of history going forward from you, a trajectory forward. And this is how science fiction has its aesthetic effect. It's relatively sophisticated aesthetic form because it requires that double vision. And there's a lot of double reading in all art forms, but in science fiction, it's very marked. And a lot of people say to me, I mean, I can't tell you how many people need to say this to me. Well, I don't read science fiction. I can't get it, or I read it when I was 10, but I don't read it anymore because adults don't bother with trivial things. Well, they're not getting it because they can never make the two images come into one. They just get a headache, like some people do.
Super interesting. So one of our questioners asked, why did you feel it necessary to change the role that the UNFCCC plays in combating climate change compared to its current role? And why was this important to the narrative?
Well, I think that international cooperation is crucial, and that the UN is the best platform that we have for it. So, and also the Paris Agreement did have that clause allowing them to make subsidiary bodies. So as a fictional tool to organize my narrative, it was the obvious one to go to, because if you're going to do science fiction, you would the hope would be to make it 90% real and then 10% shading off into a futuristic novum, but that the border from the 90% real to the 10% is obscured by the text, and the reader ends up imagining that it's all true. So that's why I did that. I want to say that it is, of course, going to be a bottom-up effort of communities, neighborhoods, towns, states, regions, and then up to the international organization at the top is necessary, I believe, but not sufficient. And I want to also add to this discourse, there's top-down, that would be us thinking that, well, the technocrats and the elites will figure something out. And indeed, we need them. And then there's bottom up, that you got to take care of your own watershed and your own garden. But there's also side to side, that these lateral arrangements between small nations, between cities, 100 million people in the United States are in cities that have made agreements with other cities to reduce their carbon burn, irrespective of what the federal government says. Well, these are side to side is I think, because we are so binary, that we think top down, bottom up, oh my gosh, but side to side is important too. And it's an all hands on deck situation.
Mm-hmm. There's another question kind of about the book as a book. They ask, they were interested in when you called this an anti-dystopian book as opposed to a optimistic book, and says, especially considering that you're a student of Jameson and given his considerable work on utopia, can you talk more about what this means, anti-dystopian, how it's important to you?
Yeah, my pleasure. And I'll try not to go too inside baseball or go on too long. It's Jameson who uses the Gray-Moss rectangle from A.J. Gray-Moss, a French structuralist. So there's a starting position, and then there's the thing that's not it, and there's the thing that's against it. So you have 3 points of a quadrangle, and then the fourth point is mysterious because it's the not or the not anti. It's the thing to be explored by this hermeneutic device, and you have to play with it. So if you start with utopia, the good society, the thing that's not it is dystopia. The thing that's against it is anti-utopia. As examples, in 1984, that government is out to put its boot on your neck. It wants the citizen subservient and suffering and obeying orders. In Brave New World by Huxley, the government wants you to be happy. It tries to create a utopia, and in trying to create a utopia, it rebounds against you and creates accidentally a dystopia. It's great that the two most famous examples of these literatures from the 20th century can serve to demonstrate what a dystopian novel is, what an anti-utopian novel is, and then what's that fourth term? Well, some people talk about anti-utopian. Anybody who's against utopia, they are wrong to think that. They are reactionary. They're hoping for the power gradient that already exists. They're status quo. They're reactionary and wrong. But you could also, instead of saying anti-utopia, you could also make that fourth term just be anti-dystopian. I'm against the destruction of the biosphere. I'm against the extinction event. And that's that fourth term that it's allied to, because of the double bounce of this quadrilateral system, it's allied to utopianism. But it's saying that maybe in the situation that we're in right now, first we dodge the dystopia, then we try to imagine that sets the grounds for a continuing dialectic that makes us then work on what would be truly utopian, having dodged the dystopia. So one could go on, obviously, and it's a complicated heuristic device. But on the other hand, it's very good to get out of the either or binaries and to include these extra terms and the both and rather than the either or in ordinary discussions, because ordinary political discussions and always are based on philosophical axioms that one is taking as axiomatic in order to ground your debate at the higher levels. And yet sometimes it's the axioms themselves that are in discussion without them being revealed as such. So if you talk about the $2 trillion works bill that the Biden administration is trying to push through, then you're arguing often the argument comes right down to uh, fundamental questions of, well, are people good or bad? Which is incredibly simplistic and axiomatic, and yet we have these axioms at the bottom of every political policy debate. And it's best to unpack them, reveal them, unpack them. Well, you're a professor of philosophy. This is all like, of course.
Well, it's not the thing I work on, but I did want to ask you about the kind of the sort of challenging the framework assumptions versus challenging, working within them. I mean, one thing that's in both what you just said now, but also, I mean, thinking about I suppose if there's a key policy innovation in the book, it's this carbon coin. And then also you bring up the Biden plan. I mean, these are in some ways, they have so many great things for progressives, both the fictional carbon coin and the actual, Biden's moves in the last couple of weeks. But they also don't have the character of disrupting the whole system that one often associates with kind of the kind of radical environmental action required to really solve this problem. And so I wonder your thoughts on that. I mean,
yeah. Well, that's a great question, Michael. And I'm thinking of Keynes. I'm thinking of the crisis of the Depression, and I'm reading a wonderful book called The Price of Peace about Keynes by Zachary Carter. I recommend it to everybody for a thoughtful reflection on what Keynes actually did and the historical context he was in. So I guess I want to ground this discussion of what kind of reform would be best in the situation that we're in. We're in a neoliberal capitalist order that is quite entrenched. It's fragile, it's brittle, it's falling apart, but it's also massive and entrenched. So both things are true at once. In that situation, I'm going to say that a science fiction device that I use is perhaps useful, and I'm an American leftist. What does that mean? And also, why is the left always fighting amongst themselves and stabbing each other in the back over policies, so that you get into a stupendous, wicked fight with an anarchist or a syndicalist, as opposed to a liberal versus a radical versus a communist versus a democratic socialist versus a social democrat? And knives are, as a novelist with different characters with different views, I've got all those knives in my back all the time, and so does everybody else on the left. I think it's a timeline problem. Some people are focused on, what do we do this week with the Biden plan? They are a center-left Democrat at that moment, trying to see what can be shoved through the Senate against resistance. I'm an anarchist. I would like there to be a complete horizontalization of power and of wealth across the planet, every human having exactly equal. If the Gini figure were to be run on them, it would be zero. But maybe that's 200 years down the line. I mean, let's not even put a number on it, but it's down the line. So I've begun to think about stepwise progress, anti-austerity, Keynesianism, social democracy, as in Scandinavia, democratic socialism, some post-capitalist system that resembles socialism, communism, anarchism. You get out there into a fuzzier zone. As you go out into the future, it gets fuzzier and fuzzier. I think that people who are interested in different zones on that timeline are fighting each other, like in some type of 1950s time travel, time war story in the science fiction literature. Wicked fights between people who are actually hoping for the same timeline, but are focused on different parts of the timeline. And this is a kind of I bring this up because it's a new thought that I've had that might remind us that it's a united front, that the front is broad, that your own personal interest in progressive causes is great and needs to be pursued, but that other individuals might have a different point on the timeline, a different focus of their interest, a different watershed, a different identity politics, that they're going to be most interested in to fight because it's the one that's slapping them in the face. And they're still part of your team. And it's pointless and counterproductive to get into wicked policy fights or theoretical fights with them when they're all on the same side anyway.
And the side is those that want. I mean, just for the listeners who maybe don't see it, it's just wanting a regenerative relationship with the rest of nature. Is the biosphere? Is that how you're thinking about it?
Yeah, justice and sustainable balance between human beings and the rest of our enabling biosphere, our cousins, our body, however you want
Mhm.
to portray it. Yes,
Okay.
I mean, I call it a leftism because in America, the American leftists have been the ones fighting that cause. I take environmentalism to be a leftism, et cetera. These are, I try to blur out these terms precisely to avoid getting pinned down
Right. Right.
into what it means in terms of any given policy situation and judge that policy situation on its own merits. What can we do right now to make it better?
Related to the political process, but on a somewhat different tack, one of our listeners asks about what like, some people call truth decay, or post-truthism, or just in general the idea that the authority of science has been eroded, especially in the last decade. How does that complicate the story for you? So climate action requires, at the minimum, accepting the reality of climate change and how serious the risks are.
Yeah, well, it's an ugly situation. And I believe that it's part of a disinformation campaign and part of the power struggle of our time, of the few against the many, of a certain small set of vested interests that somehow imagine that they can escape the constraints of the biosphere and the rest of civilization by way of wealth and power.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's a political battle, I think, and it won't go away as such. Science, to portray science as the enemy, is a horrible tactical and strategic error that may bring down the Republican Party. Because when people are sick and they're scared for their lives or they're scared for their kids' lives, they run to a scientist.
Hmm.
That's their doctor. Medicine is science. And also the food comes into your grocery store, it's been grown. We are in a scientific civilization. 8 billion people on this planet is an artificial construct enabled by the scientific method and the scientific institutions worldwide that employ that method in the real world. And so to pretend, because it is a pretense, that, oh, these scientists, they're just elites, they're trying to overpower us, when your fundamental daily existence depends on the science succeeding and proceeding as it is. Of course, the sciences can be improved. And one of the great things about science is the institutions and the method itself are always in a constant state of self-improvement, trying to make it work better than it worked before.
Hmm.
The Paris Agreement has that same kind of clause in it. Perpetual improvement, if you see that encoded in a system, is probably going to be a better system than systems that say, we've already got it perfect, we've already got it right, don't change anything. That is almost certainly wrong.
Hmm.
Uh,
And you said, it's interesting. You said in the course of those comments, you mentioned this thing that some people think they can avoid what's coming, and they're going to be sadly mistaken. Nobody can avoid the climate crisis. It's a theme in the book. I've heard you say this in other interviews. In just the minutes remaining, I mean, I guess a kind of very general question, but we often ask our guests uh, what would you like people to take away from this? And I guess this book obviously, I know it's not an advocacy book, but you are calling people to a certain way of thinking about the environment. I mean, what would you like us to all be taking from this book? If you were wildly successful, where would we walk away from?
we would walk away with all of us insisting on decent political representation, real political representation. So that's different in different countries. In the United States, the people that you elect, they need to go and vote for your interests, not for the lobbyist interests, not for the fossil fuel interests. The intrusion of money into American politics is a distortion, a power distortion that means that we don't have very good political representation. So we would need to insist on that. And then our political representatives need to listen to the scientists and do what's necessary to dodge the mass extinction event. So it's a political battle with a scientific basis to our understanding of what the political battle is about. And we will never win decisively. It's going to be a wicked political battle against enormous amounts of resistance. And so it's a discursive battle first. In other words, it's in our heads, it's in our ideas, our ideologies, our laws, and it will become physical battle of lack of food, of chaos and disorder, if we don't succeed in the discursive battle. So
Mhm.
you need either 51% or 55% or 60%. You need a working political majority to do the necessary. And so my book is just a way of imagining that the sooner we do it, the less disruptive it will be. And indeed, this whole idea of disruption is a capitalist idea. UCSD, our school, has a motto on its website: break things better. As if, I mean, this is one of the stupidest mottos ever performed, and especially by our alma mater, as if breaking things was good. Now, if you're in a capitalist economy and you break up, IBM, and you become Microsoft and Apple, and then you've broken the system and you're better. But in the real world, you break an ecosphere, you break a species, you've actually done damage. What you need is a scaffolding theory. We build a scaffold, we're like a coral reef. We build a scaffold, and then the next generation is a little higher, and they can build a scaffold a little higher. And so in scaffolding theory, breaking stuff is only when it's malformed in order to build a better scaffold. So I would urge people to pay attention to their metaphors and their images and try to work on the present problem, get a working political majority, ram through the necessary, and hope for the best.
And ironically, Kim Stanley Robinson is telling us that we should be small C conservatives in the service of anarchism. So, but it absolutely, I mean, that seems absolutely apt. I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed this conversation, Stan. I've admired your work for a long time. I think, actually in these final comments, I mean, one of the things that's so great about your novels are that you bring the science and the political together in ways that make the worlds really compelling. And I hope we'll have you back another time to talk about geoengineering and many other things. And I want to thank the whole audience for joining us today at Perry World House. We hope to see you next Tuesday, April 6th, when a panel of experts, Ambassador Henri Paul Normandin, Paige Alexander from the Carter Center, Professor Larry Diamond, and Annika Silver Leander, Head of Democracy Assessment for International IDEA, will discuss how to advance democracy in challenging times. And then on April 9th, a really special event. Please join us for Heartbeats and Soft Power, Music and International Diplomacy, with former Hungarian ambassador to the US, Andras Simoni, and former Deputy General of NATO, Ambassador Sandy Vershbow, and former New York City climate diplomat Lolita Jackson, all of whom are fabulous musicians who are going to discuss how music can shape international affairs. We'll drop links to these events and more in the chat. As always, you can access a recording of this event later on our YouTube channel. And I'm delighted to tell you that Stan has kindly offered to answer all of the questions that you put in the Q&A that we haven't gotten to, and we'll figure out a way to link that also on our YouTube channel. So please join our mailing list, follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'll drop links to all of those in the chat as well. Thank you all so much for being here today. And Stan, thank you so much. It was such a great pleasure. Looking forward to future conversations.
Thank you, Michael. It's been my pleasure. Thanks for everybody helping too. And for everybody who's checked in. Have a good day.
Happy Friday. Bye-bye.